All right, welcome back to Philosopher versus Philosopher. You ready for round 4?
Oh, I'm ready. Always.
I knew you would be.
Ah.
This time, we're tackling a classic, Plato versus Aristotle. If you're just joining us for the first time, hit that subscribe button and check out our other episode.
You won't be disappointed.
Absolutely not. We've got a mountain of sources here. Ancient texts, modern takes, all trying to untangle these philosophical heavyweights. And trust me, it gets pretty intense.
Well, they laid the foundation for Western thought, didn't they? Both titans of Greek philosophy, teacher and student, but they had some serious disagreements.
That's what makes it so interesting.
Exactly.
So let's dive in.
Where do we even begin?
Well, how about the ultimate question? What is real?
Ah, yes. The big one. Well, Plato, being the idealist, believed in this realm of perfect, unchanging forms, blueprints, if you will, existing beyond our physical world.
So like this table I'm leaning on right now.
Yeah, that's just a pale imitation, a shadow, you could say, of the true, perfect table that exists somewhere out there in the realm of forms.
So my whole life's a knockoff. That's kind of a downer.
Well, that's Plato for you. But Aristotle, he wasn't buying it.
No.
He was much more, I'd say, grounded, focused on the world we experience through our senses. This table, this is real, we can see it, touch it, study it. To Aristotle, that was enough.
He was probably the type to say, forget the shadows, let's go dissect an octopus and figure out how this thing really works.
Absolutely. And our sources point out how that love for hands-on observation led him to some amazing discoveries, especially in biology.
Which brings us to another big difference.
Right.
How we learn, right? Plato, the idealist, thought we're born with knowledge already inside us. It's just a matter of unlocking it through reason.
Right, like we have access to those perfect forms through deep thinking and contemplation. But Aristotle, he flipped the script. He believed knowledge comes from experience, from carefully observing the world around us.
So Plato's all about mind over matter, and Aristotle's saying, get out there and explore.
Exactly. And you can see how these different approaches shape their ideas about everything, even politics.
Ooh, politics. Always a fun topic.
How should society be structured? What's the best way to govern? Plato, with his love for the ideal, he envisioned a utopia.
Utopia?
Ruled by philosopher kings.
Philosopher kings. So basically, a society run by the smartest people in the room. Sounds a little elitist, doesn't it?
Maybe a bit. And our sources do highlight some potentially controversial aspects of Plato's ideal state.
Like what?
Well, for starters, he believed that to achieve complete social unity, things like family and private property, they had to go.
Whoa, that's a little extreme, don't you think? Everyone living in communes, sharing everything.
Is a radical vision.
I'll say. So what about Aristotle?
Well, he had a more practical, you might say, down-to-earth approach.
Okay, more grounded.
He studied existing political systems and argued for something more balanced, a mixed government that combined elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and even democracy.
So he was trying to find a workable solution instead of chasing some perfect ideal.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
He also thought that family and private property played an important role.
Interesting.
He believed they actually promoted responsibility and care within society, a direct contrast to Plato's communal vision.
Wow, these two are like night and day, totally different ways of seeing the world.
And those differences really come to light when we look at their views on ethics, the whole question of how to live a good life.
I'm all ears. What do they say?
Well, Plato, true to form, focused on an absolute, unchanging idea of good that you access through reason.
So again, the power of the mind.
Absolutely. Very much tied back to his theory of forms. But Aristotle had a different take. He argued that virtue, and therefore a good life, is all about balance. It's finding that golden mean between extremes.
Like not too much this, not too little that, but just, right.
Exactly. One of our sources gives this example of courage.
Okay.
To Aristotle, true courage isn't about recklessness.
No.
It's not about being a coward either. It's about finding that sweet spot in the middle, being brave when it matters, but not being foolishly daring.
I like that. So two totally different paths to a good life.
And it's fascinating to see how their different approaches, their ideas about life, knowledge, even reality, they've had such a profound impact on Western thought throughout history.
It's like Plato's up there in the clouds, searching for those eternal truths.
Yes.
And Aristotle's down here getting his hands dirty, studying the world around him.
A great way to put it.
It makes you wonder, what about us? Are we more drawn to Plato's idealism or Aristotle's pragmatism?
That's a question we'll keep exploring as we continue our deep dives. We'll see how their ideas play out in art, politics, science, even in our own lives.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back. It's amazing how these debates that Plato and Aristotle started, way back when,
Thousands of years ago.
yeah, are still so relevant today. Like, are we hardwired to chase these big universal truths
Yeah,
that,
Plato's obsessed with.
yeah, or are we more like Aristotle, grounded in the world we can see and touch and experience?
I feel like it's a bit of both, right? I mean,
Mm.
don't we need both to really understand the world?
Absolutely. And it impacts everything, how we raise our kids, how we deal with tough political issues.
Do we design systems based on these perfect ideal forms that Plato talked about?
Hmm.
Or do we accept that reality is messy and try to find solutions that actually work, like Aristotle?
I think a lot of it comes down to, are you more of a dreamer or a doer? Are you a head in the clouds idealist or a feet on the ground pragmatist?
Maybe a little of both.
Probably. Most of us fall somewhere on that spectrum. But what's interesting is to think about how much these guys influenced, well, everything. Plato's idea that the soul is separate from the body, that had a huge impact on Western
Oh,
religion.
yeah. The idea of an immortal soul, something that exists beyond our physical bodies, that's had staying power for centuries.
But then you've got Aristotle, with his emphasis on the soul as being part of the body, which led to a more scientific understanding of human consciousness.
Right. And his whole focus on empirical observation, gathering evidence from the real world. I mean, that basically paved the way for the scientific method.
Exactly. So you've got these two guys coming from the same intellectual world, but their ideas branch out in completely different directions and end up shaping the entire course of Western thought. It's pretty wild, actually.
Yeah. It's like they represent two fundamental paths to understanding the world, to understanding ourselves.
And that's what makes studying them together so fascinating, right? Their disagreements force us to confront these basic questions. How do we know what we know? What's truly real? How should we live our lives?
They're basically having a philosophical arm wrestling match across time and space, and we get front row seats.
Uh-huh. It's tempting to want to pick a side, Team Plato or Team Aristotle.
Right.
But the real value is understanding both perspectives, how they challenge and complement each other. You need both that idealism and that pragmatism to really grapple with how complex the world is.
So how do these ancient ideas, these really old ideas, play out in the modern world? What are some examples?
Well, let's take our education system. Plato's emphasis on abstract thinking, on searching for those universal truths, that's still at the heart of how we teach philosophy, math, the humanities.
Right. We value critical thinking, analyzing arguments, looking for those underlying principles that explain how everything works.
Exactly. But when we teach science, it's all about experiments, observing what happens, testing hypotheses. That's pure Aristotle.
Oh, yeah. He'd be right at home in a lab.
Totally.
Yeah.
And his ideas about ethics, about finding that balance, striving for virtue, those are super relevant today, especially when we talk about personal morality and social responsibility.
And in politics.
Mhm.
I feel like you can see Plato's influence in those ideologies that advocate for strong, centralized control, where the leaders claim to know what's best for everyone.
Yes. Some of those more authoritarian regimes throughout history tried to enforce a strict social order based on some grand idea that's definitely got shades of Plato in it. But then you have Aristotle's influence in our modern democracies. The emphasis on checks and balances, individual rights. That's very much in line with his thinking.
It's kind of mind-blowing that these philosophers from thousands of years ago still have such a hold on us, on how we see the world. Their ideas are everywhere.
They really are, woven into the fabric of our lives, whether we realize it or not. And the crazy part is, for all the progress we've made, we're still asking those same questions that Plato and Aristotle were wrestling with. What is reality? How do we know anything for sure? How should we organize ourselves? What does it mean to live a good life?
They may have had totally different answers.
Yeah.
But they both believed in the power of reason and the pursuit of knowledge.
And that's a powerful legacy.
It really is. So what about you listening? What do you think?
Yeah, think about it.
Are you more drawn to Plato's grand vision?
To those big, sweeping ideas?
Or are you more like Aristotle, focusing on the details, on what's right in front of you?
Do you believe in absolute truths? Or do you see things as more nuanced, more shades of gray? These are some really interesting questions to think about as we keep exploring these two philosophical giants.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one more thing. It's not something they said directly, but it kind of jumps out when you compare their ideas side by side.
Oh, I'm curious.
Well, they both cared deeply about virtue, about living a good life. But how they thought you got there, that was totally different. Plato saw virtue as this thing you achieve through deep thought. like you unlock some secret knowledge by thinking hard enough. But Aristotle, he thought virtue was something you build through habit, through action. You become a good person by doing good things over and over again.
That's a really interesting distinction.
It is.
It makes you wonder, in a world that's so full of information, so full of choices, how do we actually cultivate virtue? Do we need to go off and meditate in a cave for years like Plato? Or do we just focus on building good habits, making ethical choices every day, and trying to be better people right here, right now?
That's a really big question, and one we need more time to unpack.
We do.
But unfortunately, we're out of time for this part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're wrapping up our epic philosophical battle, Plato versus Aristotle.
And, last time, we ended on a bit of a cliffhanger.
We did. It's all well and good to debate these big ideas, but how do we actually live them? How do we put them into practice in our everyday lives?
Right, we were talking about virtue, how to live a good life.
Yeah, and that tension between Plato's focus on contemplation
Spending all that time thinking.
versus Aristotle's emphasis on habit and action.
Actually doing things, making choices.
So, in a world that's so busy and chaotic and full of distractions, how do we actually cultivate virtue? Where do we even start?
Well, it's interesting. Aristotle was fascinated by octopi.
He was.
Oh, yeah. Our sources talked about how he dissected them.
Study their behavior, their anatomy. He was meticulous.
A true scientist. He didn't just sit around thinking about life. He got his hands dirty, figured out how things worked.
Exactly. And maybe that's a good lesson for us, too. Instead of getting lost in abstract ideas,
Right.
we can take a cue from Aristotle and start paying attention to our own lives, our own habits, our own messy details.
So, what are the things we do every day? What choices are we making? And are those choices lining up with our values?
Yeah. Are we living the way we want to be living? Maybe we're not as honest or as kind or as courageous as we could be.
It's like we're conducting a personal experiment. We're observing our own behavior, seeing where we might be falling short.
Exactly.
Ouch. Okay, so let's say we've done that. We've identified some areas where we could be better. What then?
Well, Aristotle believed that virtue is something you practice. It's not about being perfect all the time.
Oh, thank goodness.
It's about making those small efforts every day to align your actions with your values.
So, being more intentional, choosing courage over comfort, kindness over indifference, honesty over deception.
Exactly. And just like studying those octopi helped Aristotle understand the natural world better, paying attention to our own habits, our own choices, can lead us to a more virtuous life.
It's like we're working out at the ethical gym, building up our moral muscles with each good choice we make.
That's a great way to put it.
But, that sounds kind of different from what Plato was saying. All
Yeah.
that stuff about contemplation.
Right.
How do we reconcile those two things?
Well, I think we can actually use both. We can borrow from both Plato and Aristotle.
How so?
We can take some time for quiet reflection, step back from the busyness of life.
Right.
And use those moments to think about our motivations, to reconnect with our values.
So contemplation can help us clarify what we believe in, what's important to us,
Exactly.
and then we can put those beliefs into action by building those good habits, like Aristotle said.
Exactly. It's not an either situation. We don't have to choose one or the other. We can take the best from both of these thinkers.
It's like philosophy gives us a whole toolkit, different approaches, different perspectives, and we get to decide which tools work best for us.
And how we want to use them to build a life that feels meaningful and fulfilling.
So to everyone listening, we're challenging you.
Oh, yeah. This is your homework.
Think about your own habits, the choices you make every day. Are you living in line with the person you want to be?
What are those small changes, those small steps you can take, starting today, right now?
To cultivate a more virtuous life.
It's an ongoing journey, but it's a journey worth taking. And remember,
Yeah.
whether you're more drawn to Plato or to Aristotle, the search for a good life, for a life well lived, that's something we're all in together.
That's a great note to end on. Keep those philosophical muscles flexed, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.